given the gray in my beard. But when you see me use a PowerPoint, you'll see that I still don't know how to do it very well. And I'm not doing it to impress you, that's for sure.
It'll warm up. Mr. Williams, if you're going to be walking around, I need you to get that wireless mic on.
Judge, I have never had a problem with that. I'm not often accused of being too quiet. Can I ask that Brooke let me know if it's not working? Is that okay, Judge?
As long as you're near a mic.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Otherwise, we can't pick up everything.
I'll stay here. One juror's trying to reach Cole's attention to see if.
I don't know if the TV can go a little higher. Just move your eyes your own way.
I don't know that it can. We can work on that.
Yeah, this one's kind of maybe on a break or something.
Yeah. We'll try and do it on a break.
This one's stuck. So.
Like I said, this PowerPoint may not be that important, may be helping me more than you anyway. I'm not going to stand up, as my colleague said, and tell you what I believe. That's not what opening statements are even allowed for. What I believe is not what I'm going to be talking to you about. I'm not going to argue. I'm not allowed to argue here. This is to be a conversation about what a trial is about and for, what applies in the way of important principles that you then will keep in your mind, keep with you, keep in your heart as you take in evidence. Evidence that must prove a murder. Not little dots that might make one out of an argument. Not going to argue. I'd like to talk more about the importance and solemnity, first of all, of what we're doing here. Not because I think you need me to, but I'm going to anyway. We're not at the water cooler. We're not at a home conversation. We're not in a TV show. We're in the most solemn place in our society. We're in the four corners of a courtroom, and we are applying in this case, you are applying in this case, we all are, principles, right, that our country's built on. That the blood of men and women in our service has been spilled on foreign soil to support. And I ask you to make those live every minute of this trial with every witness that is speaking to you and bringing information to you. In light of the government's burden, according to those principles, to bring proof, not argument, proof of murder, that Meggan murdered her best friend. And you've already had the level of proof read to you. It's in your instructions. What proof beyond reasonable doubt means. Real possibility. It'll be whether there's a real possibility that that didn't happen. That it's not proven. And yeah, it's got to be murder for money. You will hear about suicide, because that's not murder for money. Although it will be illegal, and you'll learn this at the end, you can't do something. You can't act in this state in aid of someone who is, according to what you believe, committing suicide. And quite frankly, that applies to if this person, in this case Kacee Terry, doesn't intend to commit suicide. In fact, it's just faking it and overdoing it to her demise. And so the single question I submit, or the largest question, not a dot, but a question under the principles that apply, is, will the state prove by evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt, with no real possibility to the contrary, that something happened in that room that Kacee Terry could not have done to herself? I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on the evidence that I expect you to see. I asked you to keep in mind that it's because the state has this burden that they go first. And witnesses are witnesses, I submit to you. They're not the state's witnesses, although of course you'll see, and it will be obvious, the biases that state's witnesses have. They know what team they're on. But they're still just witnesses. And when I ask questions, I ask you to pay attention, of course, to those answers and how they're answered, keeping these principles in mind as well. There will, however, also be evidence that you would expect in a case, in a court of law, with those burdens, in the way of forensic testing, medical information testing, and those sorts of things as well. And there'll be an investigation spoken of by Detective Varney and by Richard Hales, who worked in tandem, although as you'll learn, Richard Hales works for the prosecutor's office. And I'm going to be critical of that. I'll get to that in a moment. I'll tell you why I think that that effort isn't going to have been fair to you in your decision making in terms of the burdens of proof. Kacee Terry, Meggan, I'm going to put that up, Sundwall, I don't think it's going to be disagreed, are become the closest friends that you could imagine. And how it became that way, I think the evidence will show, is extraordinarily important. Because you will find that Kacee Terry is exhausting in the attention that she seeks from Meggan. Exhausting. And the way that she seeks that attention and engages in this friendship is just to bombard Meggan with her complete misery with being on this planet. And constantly telling Meggan that Meggan is the only one that she can have a secret, confident relationship in about wanting to pass. And I think it will be clear, and certainly in Meggan's mind, spiritually relieved by passing from this earth. Now, the way she gains that, part of the friendship, the evidence will show, is not only to just bombard and constantly talk to Meggan about how Kacee wants to die and wants Meggan to be part of that. We're going to talk in a minute about Lee and Renee, Meggan's parents, who were there because they had been asked by Kacee Terry repeatedly to give blessings to Kacee as she was going to die, and had gone to do that before. based on what Kacee was claiming. Kacee Terry absolutely planted beans that were going to grow. I might toggle back on and forth on this a little bit. Sure, you heard, you heard Ms. Thomas mention that Kacee Terry was a liar, and that is extraordinarily important in this case. Certainly, we all probably know people we think are liars, and it affects our lives one way or another, depending on the importance and the nature and severity and their ability to get us to believe. It's extraordinary, you will see in the evidence, Kacee Terry's ability to make people believe these lies. Not just the lies themselves being extraordinary, the extent to which she could make people believe them. Kacee Terry lied about this cancer, for instance. She perpetuated and maintained the lie that she had terminal cancer. She described it to one person as blood. She described it to another as leukemia of some sort. She would describe that she had terminal cancer. You will see from the evidence that, of course, that is planting a bean to get attention. And you'll see that she split the way she lied this to different people who would give her different sorts of different attention in different ways and have a different ability to fool. That is what she used, that lie, among others, but that lie to constantly get the response from Meggan of sympathy, confederacy, privacy, closeness, spirituality. And this is fueled by Kacee Terry to seek attention. But she's so good at this lie, not only, I don't know if the state's going to ultimately ask you to believe that Meggan didn't believe it, but her own family, Kacee Terry's, the evidence will be her own family believed it. A family that before her death, she lived with for years. In the same house. A good family. A very good family. Mark Farnsworth, when you hear what that poor man has been through, and his intelligence, and notwithstanding that, you would take her to the hospital for visits that were fake, at midnight, all the time. She would make these people take her around to fake treatments. For years. And it's because they believed her. They learned she didn't have any cancer. They learned she didn't have these other ailments. She would talk about kidney disease. They learned she was healthy when she died, according to the doctors. They learned it from the doctors at the hospital. The bean that continued to grow, the evidence is going to show, and I say this in light of the question about whether Kacee Terry was suicidal like she claimed 4 years and claimed it that night. There's a script for this night. I'm going to get to that. I mean a script, literally, in text messages. She did this for years, as the evidence is going to show, and as I mentioned, but things were escalating. She was calling the doctor more and more towards the end. She was talking about anxiety, depression. She talked to the doctor, mentioned suicide. You're going to hear that. She talked about suicide to some people. She certainly ramped up her supposed misery level. It's not just opiate use and opiate abuse and opiate addiction that was going on with Kacee Terry. Kacee Terry was buying, selling, exchanging drugs with other people. It was ramping up. Another thing that was ramping up. Kacee Terry was stealing from her grandparents that she was living with. Grandparents that her role in that house was to take care of. In the house where Mark lived, and then Mark's parents, Kacee's grandparents, who her grandmother was suffering from mental health disease, dementia, and her grandfather was old and trying to take care of mom, but Mark knew that they needed help, and then Mark believed that Kacee needed help. Now Kacee was hopefully going to contribute to this household by helping her grandparents. Well, what she was doing is stealing from them. And towards August 12th, it really ramped up. It ramped up, and her use was getting the money with these people she was involved in with the drug interactions, and it came to a head. There was some mention, roughly, I think we're going to hear from Mark about a week before Kacee died, that Mark had some concerns about the billings that later you're going to hear were found to have been repeatedly and constantly intercepted by Kacee to hide her stealing, and the use of the credit cards, and that Kacee was probably present, probably over her debt, probably knew, and frankly was asked to cancel the credit card, which she never did. So as you contemplate the state's position that it's somehow ludicrous to believe that Kacee Terry was actually maybe going to take the off-ramp that she had created, the evidence will show, you'll be able to contemplate whether the being had grown out of control. And she knew that life as she knew it, as a liar, had finally hit the critical breaking point, and it was going to come out. Now, Meggan Sundwall, you're going to hear about, was an easy mark for Kacee Terry. The evidence will show, and it will show through the very communications that are going to be introduced. I submit to you, cherry-picked to the extent out of 28,000 text messages that go on. Of course, there's phone calls, they have meetings, these people are friends. At one point, as you heard, they lived together. Meggan and Mitch let Kacee live with them. That she never called her on it, is what you just heard. The evidence is going to show. Meggan wouldn't call her on it. When Kacee would tell her stuff that was ridiculous. 74 degree temperature. You're going to see and hear that that happened all the time. Meggan offered unconditional love to Kacee Terry. She didn't call her out on things. You're going to hear that even her doctor didn't call her out on some stuff when Kacee Terry, as her doctor, I expect, is going to agree and testify, used the medical service process to gain attention by coming up with false maladies. You're going to learn, there's going to be Kyle Hancock. He's a psychologist. He's clinical work and he's done expert work. And he can help you understand, even from an expert standpoint, not only about someone like Kacee and someone like Meggan, but what that means in terms of those two types of people having a relationship and the dynamics of that. So as the government suggests that Meggan should have called her on it, stopped being an unconditional friend, I think you'll be able to look from the evidence as to why that would be, to the extent that it's not already obvious. And quite frankly, throughout their relationship and throughout conversations and throughout constant and exhausting pleas from Kacee for Meggan to unconditionally accept what she said, unconditionally show love, and promise to see her through the end with blessings from her father and being present in a form of helping her by being present when she died. They were even referenced spiritually. Freedom from the pain that Kacee was claiming in the form of a spiritual release. This is the room where Kacee Terry essentially died. She went to the hospital and was taken off support, but I think the evidence is going to show she was never going to live after paramedics took her from this room. I blew that up. You can see on the left, up next to her bed in a frame, are Kacee and Meggan. The closest thing to Kacee when she essentially passed. This is the room that is the scene of what the supposed murder was. Or a suicide. What Meggan believed to be a suicide, it looked like a suicide. It was another fake that Kacee overdid. The events. Yes, you're going to hear again about all of these communications, and some will be picked out that sound pretty bad if you don't know them in context, like I just described to you. I think the evidence will show full context. Discussion about, if you're so desperate, I hope you just do it. I hope you just commit suicide. I'll help you if I could, Meggan says. She's being bombarded by Kacee begging to go. And by the way, this is an insulin overdose death. It's not a new topic in their relationship. You will see from the evidence that talking about dying by insulin always in terms of a suicide, a way to pass, had been talked to them, between them, for years and years. When she lived there, you'll see texts that show that because of that, Meggan would even bring it and have it in the house. They're not diabetics. There's no diabetics that live there. Casee's not a diabetic. It wasn't. Insulin isn't some suddenly nefarious factor in this case that showed up on the 12th. Talk a little bit in a minute about what you're going to hear about. Quite frankly, Insulin, when she moves in to Mark's house, her grandparents' house, is everywhere, all the time, unaccounted for, all sorts of them, because Mark's a diabetic, mom's a diabetic, sister's a diabetic, and his brother Kyle's a diabetic who unfortunately died in January of 24, so 7 months before what we're talking about here. So Insulin talks about as a method of suicide with Meggan in these texts. I think there's going to be witnesses that say they've seen it, and you're going to see that Kacee is begging her to help her be able to have access to that and saying she's going to use insulin to kill herself. Well, apparently you're going to hear that she's telling her sister, Meggan's trying to kill me. Manipulating her sister at one point, to move her out of the house, where she's got to freeload in the basement of Mark's house and does basically nothing except deal with getting and using opiates and other drugs of abuse. The events were scripted out in Texas, you'll see. They planned for Meggan to go be over there, and once again, that Kacee would use insulin to engage in an overdose. And again, it's uncontroverted. She had the ability to get insulin anywhere she wanted in that house, and no one would even know. Same for syringes. Now this port is different. You don't need a syringe for a port. You can inject something into a port through just a plunger type syringe that doesn't have a needle. You'll hear evidence that that probably wouldn't have been used it caused the death here because of the different way it would act if you just put it right into a port versus subcutaneously. So there was a script. She was going to come over, and Kacee would be there, Meggan would be there, and Kacee would engage in an overdose. Suicide. When Meggan gets over there, Kacee's already got a glucometer, glucose reading instrument. There and ready. I think you're going to find out the police didn't even realize that she'd already taken a test result. And you can draw inferences as you go through this trial when you hear that about why Kacee Terry's already checking her blood before Meggan ever gets there. This glucometer, ultimately they find, was used to take a whole bunch of readings. In a minute I'm going to show you, thank goodness for Meggan, that this was used. Then throughout the day, eventually, because the glucometer tells us what Kacee's condition was, and ultimately it deteriorates to the point that Meggan, who when she went over there, didn't know whether it was going to work, didn't know what was going to happen there, didn't know whether this was just yet another where Kacee would say, I guess it didn't work. She had plans for an anniversary dinner with her parents that night, and then she worked at night as part of her second job, and had expected that she would be going to work. And when it was clear from the use of the glucometer that, and what she could observe, that Kacee probably was done from her cancer and or the insulin overdose, she was not going to live. And so Meggan called her parents. And her parents left the dinner, or I can't remember, I'm sorry if they'd already started, but they abandoned their dinner plans and came over. Lee and Renee went in there. Now, I think the evidence will show that neither Kacee, despite all these years, nor Meggan was ever going to tell anyone that that's how Kacee was going to pass. Part of the confidentiality, part of the sanctity of their relationship. And, as we're talking about in a minute, probably something that, quite frankly, even though she was willing to be present for, even encourage in terms of her release, not consistent with, she could get in trouble. get in trouble with work, her license, etc., isn't letting her parents know what had been happening during that day. Just that she was dying. And that Meggan had stayed with her. But what happens is, by the way, you're going to hear and see in the text, some text message evidence that all through this time, Kacee had constantly told Meggan she had a do not resuscitate, a DNR. She had constantly told Meggan that Meggan was going to be power of attorney. She had gone to burial plots to talk about the places she was planning on being buried. She had told Kacee that she wanted Bella, her dog, cremated and buried with her. Bella, by the way, is, I think, a sister or brother to Meggan's dog, too. Came out of the same litter. She had told everyone else the evidence is going to show the opposite, that Meggan was some sort of awful person, that she was afraid of Meggan, that she thought Meggan was going to hurt her or kill her. What happens when Mark, the uncle, comes down from his office upstairs at 9? And by the way, I'll let the evidence play out on that day. I'm not sure what Mark's going to say from the stand. You may hear that some testimony has been given in various places in this lawsuit, and recorded interviews were given with witnesses, and so sometimes that may be needed to be used to refresh their recollection. The best I can tell you is what I expect, and you'll see it happen. But when Mark comes down, he calls Kylie because of the distress, obvious distress, that Kacee's in, and Kylie loses it. She says, call the paramedics, Meggan is killing her. Immediate accusation. And sounds like, based on what I think that you'll find were lies by Kacee to Kylie. Meggan calls Kylie. And Kylie lays into Meggan, get out of the house, you're killing her, I'm going to get you put away or take you out or something to that effect, and is screaming at Meggan accusations. The importance of that is for you to consider what Meggan does end up doing, which in a lot of ways made her look pretty bad. She now knows that someone's going to actively go after this. She ultimately, on this subject, speaks, she has this worried response. She does speak to the police, but she also, I think the evidence will show, realizing she's going to be accused, realizing she was there, maybe suicide will come up, it's on everyone's phones, deletes like 280 messages about insulin. I think the evidence would be over the course of all of this communicating time, there's probably 5,000 messages with insulin in them. These are close in time and proximate to that day. Sure thing, I think the evidence is going to show that Meggan would have preferred not to have anyone know she was present when her friend passed. But does the evidence prove she did something? You can't do something to help someone in a suicide. And no one here is, I mean, we all know you can't kill them. In her interviews, she doesn't tell the story. She explains what she did. She's not asked much. I think they're going to play the interviews. She doesn't tell what happened in there. They used a glucometer. Kacee was committing suicide. And she deletes these texts. Can't do that. Her worst reason is it makes you look pretty bad. Please say that. As they're finding out about the deletions of texts and stuff, the police are telling her, it doesn't look good for you. The text does not look good for you. being there with these texts that talk about insulin on an insulin overdose does not look good for you. But in one interview, Richard Hales, now Special Agent Hales, I'm going to work hard to get it right. My understanding is it's new, the Special Agent title, and so I've been referring to him, and everyone deserves their title. Detective, Special Agent Richard Hales. He explains what the principles we're applying in this court mean. Dead on. Does not look good for you. So we're doing other things. DNA, forensics, medical. You're saying you didn't do anything. When he asked her the blunt question, did you do something? Did you do something in that room in relation to Kacee's overdose on insulin? You've said no, that's great, but if there's evidence to prove otherwise, we have a problem. Meaning Meggan. Fair enough? Meggan says, yep. And if there's not, I will ride off into the sunset. There wasn't. All the efforts that were made with DNA, with serology, with toxicology, with medicine, with FBI labs, everything that was tried, and unfortunately some very poor police work compromised the ability to get results in some cases that we can rely on. Failed to prove in a court of law, failed to be evidence and proof that Meggan did something in that room. And the reason is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias occurs when an officer believes in or searches for evidence to support a favored theory while ignoring or excusing contrary evidence and is disinclined to change the belief. It's normal. We all have confirmation bias. But in police work, we can all imagine and agree and we need to pay attention to the evidence of how it could have affected the proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Whether it makes Meggan look guilty. If you think at the end of the trial, of course, that she did it, you'll have to acquit, because it has to be proven, or proof that Meggan's guilty with no real possibility otherwise. That's in your instruction. So what was the evidence? In the room, the paramedics come. Yes, Meggan and her family are told to get out, and they do. They leave. Although Meggan's mother, who also believed in the DNR that Kacee said she had, and Kacee's desire not to be resuscitated and to go to where she wanted to go, was pretty mad. She was pretty hot. She said, Meggan is her best friend. You're doing the wrong thing by calling the paramedics. And then they're ushered out, told to get out. Mark calls them, the paramedics come. They do what they need to do. It's always tough on a scene. We're going to call it a crime scene. That's the state's theory, is that it's a crime scene. Because they need to do what they need to do, and sometimes it can affect, obviously, the integrity of the crime scene. They leave, and here's what is ultimately in that room. Syringes. 2 syringes are found. There's some of the plunger type that you could use for the port. 2 syringes at least. Turns out there's 3. I'll get to that in a minute. That are insulin syringes. In other words, the means for Kacee Terry to utilize them to inject insulin into her body. And like I said, the evidence is that that's not surprising, since they're all over the house and available to her at any time. they send these syringes. Let me be clear about the two syringes, because I just misspoke. There's a syringe that is found over by where Kacee Terry is. I think the evidence exhibit's going to be 2, or not exhibit for you, but police item number. The one found in the room. What happens is, Mark, ultimately, about 3 or 4 days later, is out cleaning up some things outside in the patio area where Kacee would go meet friends, smoke cigarettes and such, and had a garbage can for this Fanta box up in the upper left-hand corner. That Fanta box he was going to crush to throw away. That's, by the way, Fanta is what Kacee drank. Fanta orange. There's Fanta orange cans in the room. You'll see the evidence, you'll see the body camera. And as he manipulated the box before he crushed it, he could tell something was in it. So he pulled it out, and it was a rag, a black rag. You can see it in the right part of that picture. And a syringe, a box that no blog insulin could be in. And a piece of paper that would come from the box. In other words, evidence. So he called Detective Varney. Detective Varney said, "Oh, take some pictures of it, I'll pick it up later." But in that, there's a syringe. So we have one syringe from the room at that point. We have another syringe. And then when Detective Varney came over to pick up the Fanta box evidence, Mark told her, "Hey, I had to rip out the carpet and strip down the room." The reason is because the day after this happened, believe it or not, a massive hailstorm occurred and it flooded Kacee's room. But when Mark says, "Oh, while I was doing that," this is the 19th now, when they've come to pick up the evidence. "When I was doing that, I found another syringe in the room." Here it is. And that's the one on the far right, still in the evidence bag. Those 3 syringes were available, in other words, within days. And the police sent them to the crime lab to get tested for the sort of evidence that Chales was talking about. DNA, fingerprints, and such. Didn't turn out to be good candidates for getting fingerprints. And DNA-wise, they found some DNA. I think you'll hear that with regard to one of the syringes, the DNA wasn't capable of being compared to Meggan, Mark, Kacee. Those standards were used. Those are the people, the DNA they're trying to find. With the other syringe, it was possible to get enough DNA to find out the following. Mark's DNA was on it. Kacee's DNA was on it. Meggan is excluded from any DNA on it. By the way, as you're going to hear, they arrested Meggan in March of 25. March 20th. The results that I just described, you hadn't even come back yet. No DNA from Meggan, no fingerprints from Meggan. And one of the other things you're going to learn is that it turns out that Detective Varney and Special Agent Hales never collected the Fanta box or the rag. I think the evidence will be that there's probably not a better item to get DNA off of than a rag. And not a better item to get fingerprints off of than a smooth surface of a Fanta box. Mark hadn't put those in the bag. Detective Varney said, toss the stuff in a bag and I'll come get it. Although, incredibly, when they went over to pick up the bag, Marks showed him he still had the Fanta box in the rack. They just let him toss it back in the trash. We know so that's the state of that evidence. We have syringes now with Mark saying he found one when he ripped up the carpet the next day. 2 in the room, 1 in a Fanta box. A vial with some missing that Mark will testify to be enough to kill a non-diabetic, in his opinion. Let's talk about the glucometer. Thank goodness. Now, granted, you're going to hear that Meggan didn't tell him what happened in the room that day. Didn't tell him about a glucometer, about an insulin overdose, about Kacee's plan. This glucometer was used, and it was used by Meggan. That'll be the evidence, because right around 43, which was at 1:43 p.m., a reading of 43, you're close to, if not unconscious. It's not clear. Definitely at 30, that's 2 o'clock p.m. This shows that Kacee would have been unconscious, and it shows that she would have never regained consciousness. So it gives a timeline. My understanding is, with all these experts and all of this medical testimony, and taking this evidence for what it's worth, there is no medical way to find that after Kacee's blood sugar was 43, more insulin went into her. Submit the evidence you're going to hear from any expert that comes to that end is going to be, sorry, I touched my computer and messed it up. Is going to be that whatever time insulin went into Kacee Terry, she would have been able to do it to herself. In fact, the timing of that could have been before Meggan even got there. That's the best the medicine and the experts can tell us. So the glucometer, thank goodness, gives us a timeline that demonstrates that exogenous insulin could have been administered by Kacee Terry to herself. And no evidence shows that anything would have been injected after she couldn't do it to herself. I showed you some other syringes. A couple months later, it sounds like, Mark actually also found more syringes in his brother Kyle's room, which is right down the hall, the next bedroom from Kacee's. Some of them, one of them at least, was preloaded. Kyle was a diabetic and would preload syringes and put them next to in his bedside stand or something. By the way, this room was never searched by the police. Mark happens to, he was going to move in there, and Mark happens to find those empty syringes and one that was preloaded in the room right there next to where Kacee's room was. And he saves them to his credit. Apparently not really connecting the dots on their evidentiary value right when he found them, but he sticks them in the fridge. And as recently as December of last year, 3 months ago, they come to light, and the police now have 4 syringes. 4 more syringes, one loaded, presumably with insulin. He sent those to the lab for fingerprints only, and surprisingly, they don't come back with fingerprints. So the point is that the scene, the evidence, the forensics of this case will show you that they're absolutely consistent with Kacee Terry doing whatever caused her death to herself. And let alone a real possibility. They're absolutely consistent. But the police don't fault the evidence. The prosecution, who's involved in this case from the start, you'll hear, and whose own investigator is doing the work. Despite this evidence, despite not even having medical records, despite the medical examiner's report you're going to hear, the medical examiner is going to say, then and now, this manner of death is undetermined. Their expert medical examiner, based on what I have heard so far, is all I can tell you what I expect, is going to agree. The manner of death is undetermined, and it's not because we don't know that it's insulin. It's because we don't know whether Kacee did it to herself. But this case is going forward anyway. The police went and arrested Meggan before most of these results were in, before medical records were back. That confirmation bias will drive all the way into this courtroom. I ask you to pay attention to that notion, pay attention to the responsibilities by these principals in relation to that. Everybody, frankly, their evidence is their minds are blown about how they got fooled by Kacee Terry in so many ways. Meggan, after that relationship, learning. But the evidence, regardless of all this cherry-picked texting we're going to hear about, absolutely will not prove, according to the principles that apply here, Meggan some murderer or even some helper in suicide, other than a confidant and a best friend who watched her friend die but got charged with murder. For that reason, you'll be returning a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.